Okay, we're live. So welcome to the final round of the Lsvw in its inaugural year. And thanks to all of you for participating. So I think I don't think anybody's been on a previous panel, so I'll give you the basic overview here. We're going to go through and offer comments on the paper. We'll do some introductions, and then we'll go through and do comments on the paper. We try to do it kind of in sections. So we kind of start with the introduction, but really what that is intended to be kind of some overview or big picture stuff, framing issues. And then we kind of work through the paper and talk about the theory, and then some of the research design and empirics, and then back to kind of big picture stuff, or I guess wide open to any kind of miscellaneous comments that we have. Andrew will have a shot to give us any context he wants, although he's not expected to give any kind of presentation. So we'll give him a chance to introduce the paper at least when we get started. And so you can kind of, I'll sort of try to I'll try to keep a cue. Sometimes it's a little hard, but so you can kind of raise your hand and try to wave your attention or butt in if you have something. But if you put up one finger, then I'll kind of put you in the normal line to offer comments. Put up two fingers, it means you want to kind of jump in as soon as possible to add on to something that's just being said. So that's the basic rules. We'll keep it as best possible. So can we go down the line and introduce ourselves quickly, and then we'll give it to Andrew, and then we'll start. You want to go ahead and go first, Michael?
Yeah, so I'm Michael Lynch. I'm a professor at University of Georgia.
Okay. Chris?
Hey, I'm Chris Miller. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, and I realize I don't have headphones, so if I need to go get some, just let me know and I'll do it.
Sometimes you're okay without them, don't worry.
So far, so good. Jason?
I'm Jason Roberts, University of North Carolina.
Ellie?
I'm Ellie Powell, the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Andrew?
I'm Andrew Clarke. I'm a third-year graduate student at the University of Virginia.
I'm Nate Monroe, professor at University of California, Merced. Okay, Andrew, do you want to...
today that we can only work at only people from public universities.
This is the public, major public institution. All right, Andrew, you're up.
Okay, so I guess I just have three things. First, the second survey with the Tea Party and sort of valence results is still actually live. There's a long story behind that, but those results are preliminary, so I'm really looking forward to any feedback on the analysis there. Second, this is my first sort of foray into anything resembling political behavior. So this was all meant to be sort of a validation of the mechanism, I'm assuming, in some observational work that I'll be incorporating at some point if I can actually trim the fat of the paper. And then finally, thank you all for doing this. I know this is not only the last one of the year, but also right after Midwest, so I'm sure we're all paneled out, so I appreciate it.
Okay. All right, anybody want to kick us off with some initial framing and introduction comments?
Well, I can get started, I suppose, since we're all jumping at the bit here. So I think, first of all, I think this is really interesting, and I have a lot of smaller stuff, but this is my first time doing this, so I'll save all that stuff. But the big framing thing, I think that you undersell the contribution if this is a freestanding paper in some ways. And I think in terms of the framing, you've got this kind of competing sense of the internal reasons for these party faction caucuses and the external, and I think you could hit harder on why the external is so important, because that's really the focus here. So I think it's all there. It could just, you could say it more, maybe more forcefully, that, you know, this is, yeah, these two things exist, but if this paper is to be about the external or the kind of electoral role of these caucuses, I wouldn't be apologetic that you're not dealing with the other stuff, right? Rather just kind of set it aside and really make a strong case. And I said I think the seeds are all here, but you could just articulate it more forcefully about why this is important, about why these types of caucuses serving as a heuristic to citizens is important in this partisan environment, in a two-party system with diverse parties. You know, we know citizens get confused and they have trouble. You know, somehow I think you could say that even more. And I think, I don't know if you want to save some of the internal stuff or a whole different paper, different chapter. But anyway, that in terms of framing, I think everything is here, and in some ways there's a lot here. So maybe kind of cutting this piece a little bit more sharply might help. I'll pass the baton.
All right, Nate, I think you're going to put us in order going back through, but I'll go ahead and take a swing. And
Okay.
in general, I like the frame and the setup. I would maybe frame it a little more broadly in terms of that this is another example of endogenously created institutions. Sorry, this is the 12th paper I've given comments on in like the last 5 days.
Yeah.
So much like parties, committees, everything else that goes on in the chamber, these are things created by the members for the benefit of members. And I think if you framed it a little more broadly that way, it wouldn't dive so quickly into, let's talk about all the divisions within parties, and would give you a little more, maybe a little more, get people outside of these fields to care a little more, maybe than as it's currently framed.
Okay. Michael?
Yeah, so I guess broadly, it's interesting. I'm especially interested in eventually getting around to talking about the theory and some of the nuance of the theory. I know the valence part is not finished, but in some ways maybe because it was not quite complete, in some ways that seems quite a bit different than the rest of the paper to me.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if, at least for as freestanding paper, you'd want to kind of excise those and think about that being separate analysis for now. And, to be fair, I know you're not done, and that's maybe in some ways a little more underdeveloped in the other parts of the paper, but it did seem really quite a bit separate from the rest of the paper, and especially the theory that you set up. I wasn't quite sure how the valence fit into the figure 3 and 4, which for me were the kind of my visualization of the theory. But
Ellie?
Yeah, so I share the comments that others have given. I think one thing that might be interesting to explore in the framing of it, and you sort of almost have enough to set up to do it this way, would be to explore a little bit more the sort of variance you'd expect across factions theoretically in terms of who's going to pursue the sort of inside versus outside strategy. You can sort of see things like the Tea Party as being really more of a grassroots outside strategy type of organization, where as the Blue Dogs, historically, my impression was that they were more of a sort of internal, practical caucus for the advantage of members to work cohesively and sort of push the agenda that way. So, you might want to sort of think about taking advantage of this variation in caucuses and the different strategies and resources these different subgroups have to pursue. I share Nate's thought about or whoever's thought about that last section being a little underdeveloped, and I think there's going to be a choice about whether it can be fleshed out more and integrated better into this paper, or if it should just be a separate, just a separate standalone piece. I think either strategy would be reasonable to pursue, but one needs to make a choice, I think, either way.
Let me follow on that, because Ellie hit on something that I wanted to push a little bit, and I'll really just extend what she said, which is one of the main comments in the Blue Dogs, and I know I'm more familiar with the Blue Dog case than I am with most of the others, and so the Blue Dog example really stuck out, because one of the things that is clear about the Blue Dogs is that they were not, at least if they may have been, it's not clear whether they were primarily focused on sending sort of electoral signals or branding signals, but they certainly were very concerned with being sort of pivotal, right? So they saw themselves as much as anything, a group that could have more strength in numbers in terms of being pivotal on budget votes by having the caucus and holding together on certain things, and they very explicitly ignored certain policy areas and were forbade from taking a Blue Dog position on certain policy issues as a caucus, because they wanted to focus their voting power on particular agreed upon, mostly fiscal issues. And so one of the things that I think implies as a more general point about the framing, and I think ultimately about the theoretical setup, is that you do have a very different, it's a different calculation for groups that have the meaningful probability of being pivotal on votes, and that probably mostly means centrist coalitions are going to have different calculations than peripheral coalitions, right? So the Tea Party coalition becomes pivotal on some votes, but they're weirdly pivotal, right? I mean, they're sort of pivotal in a way that is mostly internal to the caucus, right? When we look at some of the stuff that Boehner had to fight about, it was mostly making a decision about not whether or not they could pass at all, but whether or not he was going to go sort of with the minority party on certain things. So I just think that it's worth at least considering that as a separate motivation that you either just don't deal with in this paper, or that you do try to incorporate in some way.
Okay.
I guess if I could add on to that a little bit, I think because of what Nate's saying and kind of having differential expectations for how these should work, I'd be interested in having you do some more work with how it affects people relative to their own reported ideologies, and if there's targeted people that you would actually expect there to be a differential effect for the Tea Parties among conservatives in the Republican Party, or moderates in both parties are more likely to be affected by the frames, right? I mean, you have all that data there, and it would be nice to have you have some kind of differential expectations among subgroups of respondents in terms of how these effects should take place, right? Because if a party is, or if this is a signal that you're trying to reach out to certain types of voters, part of the thing, the activist thing, if you're an activist in the Democratic Party and you view a blue dog as being much more conservative, potentially that's actually a bad thing, right? And I don't know how you kind of parse that out to have, how are these affecting different groups, and are these actually in line with the goals that members have? And again, I think having a moderate group and a more extremist group that you can each other would help you really get after some more nuance in that area. So
looking at just target audiences more closely, I guess, in the survey results.
Yeah, I mean, you have it, right? They have the slider where they know where they are, and I think there's some kind of interactive effects that I would expect to see where some of these effects really should be conditional on where you're located spatially, what party, but also where in each party, right?
Chris?
If I can piggyback onto that, I think it's a great point, and I think the benefit of incorporating people's own self-placement or their partisanship, or however you want to think about it, is actually that you do two things with it. One is just described, but it was also a point that I think matters for your heuristic theories, because depending on information levels and kind of where people are situated, the psychology part of it, there's different expectations about how much you should rely on a heuristic, how applicable it is to you, how much information you get from that signal. So incorporating people's position will help you both in kind of the partisan and the political ways, and then also it might help bolster some of your psychological, theoretical underpinnings. So I think that's a really great place to spend some time.
I should also note, this didn't make it in the draft, but I've got some for the second survey for the Tea Party stuff. I've got a manipulation check, para-manipulation check questions at the end, and when I look at those people who sort of pass manipulation checks, so they put the Tea Party to the right of the Republican Party and so on, the results are much stronger, sort of across all of these things. Now I haven't looked to see sort of which subgroups are actually passing the manipulation check yet, but yeah, so I've got a lot to do in terms of, with the data I have, trying to unpack what's actually going on in the survey there. If that makes sense, I don't know if,
Okay, any other comments on the framing or intro? Okay, let's move on to the theory. So I'm happy to go down the line, but if anyone wants to quickly volunteer to go first, I'm happy to go into that.
I'm happy to start there.
Okay, go ahead, Michael.
I kind of like graphs, so I'm going to ask you a little bit about the figures 3 and 4, which to me are, in some ways like a nice kind of visual summary of the graphs, or of the theory. So you have these labeled as democratic signals, and I'm curious as to why that's the choice as opposed to some kind of perceived location of where people are, and whether this is kind of a maximization where I know Democrats are roughly distributed in a certain way, and I'm going to assume they're kind of near the median of the distribution. So that's one question I have. I'm also very curious about the kind of expectations you have for variance here. So it looks like in the figure 3, as you move from the top panel to the lower panel, you actually have a wider set of the variance of the signals spreads out, and in some ways it's kind of counter to what I was expecting when I was reading the text and then looking at the figures. I was almost expecting the precision to go up, and once someone announces, hey, I'm a blue dog, I actually know what kind of Democrat they are, and that kind of gives me a better expectation of where they're located. So I was kind of curious. You had
originally the theory that I was working with was building off of Grinovisky's book Party Bonds, and he's got an article too on this. So I was adjusting this sort of Bayesian learning model where so essentially I've scrapped that part of it. It was becoming very quickly intractable, and I wanted to sort of do something simple and convey what I was doing for both Midwest and this. So that's a little bit of a disconnect between old and current work.
Okay.
Yeah, so the variance part for the sort of post-Blue Dogs distribution of signals, I guess I was thinking about this in terms of where they're thinking about the party, not the candidate in particular. So in the model, the way I've been thinking about it, they don't know where the candidate is, but they know where the party is. And so because they're receiving new signals that are sort of spreading out the distribution towards the center, there's now more noise from liberal and centrist signals. But I mean, those figures were drawn in PowerPoint with very rough sort of.
Well, so in a weird way, the figure 3 kind of has some implicit hypothesis that I think you have data for, but that you don't really look at, which is, when the blue dog shows up and you have new information about blue dogs, it should kind of impact the way that people think about the Democratic Party in general.
Yeah.
And you have that data, and I could kind of tell what was going on with it by looking at your other figures. But I would be really interested to see a difference of means test, the same kind that you report for the location of the candidate, to show me what does simply letting you know, hey, there's this blue dog guy involved. What does this do to how I think broadly about Democrats and Republicans, right? Because it does look like there's some movement there. And I don't know if you want to do that, and if you don't, I would be tempted to kind of excise figure 3 or think of another way to explain that, so you're not talking about this kind of broad perception of party that's going to change when blue dogs are involved or not, right? And in some ways, that's the kind of broad theory of how factions work and what kind of factions not impact just for an individual member and how they're perceived by constituents, but this broader how is the party in general perceived when you have factions doing different things. I think it's a really interesting question and potentially something you could do some more work on. But at least right now, it either needs a little more work or not, maybe be removed, I think.
Yeah,
so,
I'll just say that I've looked at, I can't remember if I did the t-test for just the Democratic position across control and treatment group, but I do remember seeing that the treatment group, the location of the Democratic Party was much noisier than the control group. And so I can look back at that, but I have to think hard about if, I can't remember whose previous comments, laying out both types of, both ways that caucuses might affect the brand is maybe too much to do in one paper, but I'll think more about that.
Okay.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, so I think you're probably going to start to hear a lot of overlapping things. In terms of the theory, 2 places I think that haven't maybe new little points. I would try to be more explicit about why you expect activists to use heuristics, either more or to use them better. I think again, it's something that's there, but I think it sounds like at this point this paper has a lot in it. And so some of the things you'll be able to go deeper into if other parts come out, just because it'll give you more flexibility and more space. But just to be more explicit, and maybe in relation to that, I think in the discussion of heuristics, it's a little bit brief if the focus of this paper is really going to be about the heuristic cues in the electoral context of party faction caucuses. And so you might expand on that and give a little bit more space to also the school of thought that thinks heuristics don't solve problems necessarily, or that, I think that debate both in political science and also in psychology is more varied. And you get to that at the end, especially when you start talking about how activists you might use the heuristics differently. And and some of those nuances of it. And so if that's the direction the paper's going to go, I would foreshadow more of that in the theoretical discussion. Yeah.
I would just follow up with that. The activist point I think is really interesting. In some ways, I think my expectation is activists shouldn't need a heuristic because they're activists and they kind of know what's going on. And so in some ways, I think the results that you're getting that are strong for activists might be at least in part because you're asking people about a member that's not their member, which, you know, if it was, you could imagine if you had the resources, which would be impossible, to ask everybody about their own member, activists probably wouldn't actually be moved by suddenly knowing, hey, it turns out my members in the Blue Dogs are not, right? They know their members. And so in some ways, I think those are, I would be a little more careful with how you report those, because I think, again, activists talking about a member that isn't theirs is in some ways a little bit unusual, right? If your goal is to tell me how factions influence the connection between members and their constituents. So it's just something that's related.
Yeah, so one thing I've been back and forth on just on this topic is sort of the target audience. So I've been back and forth on framing this as a constituency focused or, you know, something to do with donations more particularly, because I think it's probably happening at both levels, and activists probably makes more sense for the activist results probably make more sense if I'm framing this as I don't know this member, but I know that it's a certain type of Democrat or Republican I support. But okay.
I mean, that's not to say that activists don't contribute and support candidates not where they live, right? So potentially, you know, having Joe Wilson yell something during the State of the Union speech is a useful heuristic for people who are going to send him $20 who don't live in South Carolina, right? But so, I mean, you could spin the story in a way that I think it makes sense, but I don't know. The fact that, you know, well, it shouldn't jump to results, but the fact that your results show that activists are actually more likely to be affected by the frames in some ways is like a little counterintuitive to me. So I think developing that a little more on the front end might help me get ready for that result.
Chris, did you have something else before?
No, I can pass it along.
Okay. Jason, go ahead.
So probably more to say about this in any other section, but I think you want to think more deeply about what each of these groups is trying to accomplish. I think they have a multitude of goals that exist that are far beyond simply signaling something to the electorate. I mean, just to give a couple examples, the Democratic Study Group was not formed to signal to the world that they were different. They were formed to change the Democratic Party so that it fit with what they thought the Democratic Party was supposed to be. They actually thought they were the majority and that the rules of the House were making it not work out that way. The Blue Dogs, in contrast, though, actually wanted to be different. They wanted to signal to people who used to be Southern Democrats who were becoming Republicans that, hey, I'm like one of the old Republicans. I'm like one of the old Democrats. I'm not like these new people. I'm not a Nancy Pelosi or someone like that. I think when you think more about what the groups are trying to accomplish, that will help you tease out your expectations a bit better than you have now. I mean, you know, the Tea Party and the Main Street Coalition do not have similar goals. So then I think this is back to something Michael mentioned. Even if they are signaling something electorally, I think you want to think about what party electorate they're signaling to. I mean, you go back to your figure 3, you've sort of drawn that as a blue dog. Well, the Tea Party's not trying to signal to the median voter of their district. They're trying to signal to someone who's not the median voter. In many ways, they're thinking about their primary constituency, not their general election constituency. And so that could change the kind of strategies they pursue. And I think you need to be a little more sensitive to how these groups are different and their strategies are different and how that may affect the kinds of signals they're sending. I'll follow up on Michael's point on figure 3. I agree that looks sort of funny. You'd almost expect it to look bimodal in the case of factionalism.
Yeah.
And then I'll comment a bit on the activist hypothesis. I have to admit I didn't follow that one so much. It seems to me that heuristics are something, I'm talking a little out of my specialty here, but heuristics typically work best for people who have less information. And when we think about this in the real world, it's the activists who actually have more information, the people who know enough about Congress to know which people are conservative, which ones are liberal, who's different from their party, and who's not. The heuristics are for the people who don't know any better. And so I wonder if in the context of this experiment where it's outside of an election, it's not your member, you're presenting this to people in a very much information-starved environment. You made up some of the people, right? Like, these aren't real people. So someone who is politically knowledgeable or who cares about what you're doing, they're grasping and searching for information, and they happen to know enough to know that this Tea Party thing means something or this Blue Dog thing means something. So they're grasping onto that. Not because I think in the real world that these are the people who'd be grasping onto that, but because these are people who know enough to pass your test, essentially.
Right.
So I do think you want to maybe rethink that hypothesis a little bit. It almost comes across as something that you backed out of results rather than something you worked out from first principles.
Chris wants to jump in real quick, Jason, and we'll go
I'm done then, so go ahead, Chris.
Oh, sorry, no, I just actually was going to follow up on this. I think this point about what heuristics and signals mean to activists is really good. There's the dyadic versus national audience that I think is key, and on the frame about whether you're thinking about this as like national donors. But then there's also this issue about, do you know enough to even know what the signal is? So I think the activist word is tricky because it cues something else, but essentially those people know what Blue Dog means enough to take a cue off of it. Whereas what you're finding is that for some of the respondents, they don't even know what to make with the Blue Dog cue. In some sense, it's a non-informative signal to low-information participants. And so I think whether you call them activists or want to change the language, I mean, everybody, I don't know if you want to go into political knowledge because there's a whole cottage industry on that, certainly. But I think that gets conflated. And one of the questions I had that I think is directly to Jason's follows up on his suggestion is I was wondering if this was ongoing, you could have an iteration of an experiment where you had a paragraph explaining what the caucus is and then see if that equalizes the effects, because that would give all respondents the same information about what Blue Dog means or what Tea Party means and might help tease out some of these differences. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on that idea.
I'll just say quickly, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I remember reading some work on political heuristics that suggested the people who are most able to use heuristics are the ones that need them the least, so high information voters are most able to sort of detect these. So that's where this hypothesis is coming from. It's this sort of cool paradox, but I could put that up front and motivate this much better as well.
Ellie, do you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the things that people are picking up on is sort of disconnect here between the theory you've laid out and some of the empirical tests you have, and sort of how are we measuring this like activism versus information dynamic. And I wondered too, essentially, whether what you're picking up with your activists are people who can understand enough to know the label. And I think Chris's suggestion about sort of explicitly finding out what people know or giving them information about the labels is a great idea to see what sort of variation that provides in your results. But if what we think is driving this is a lot of people don't understand the Blue Dog label, it suggests that primarily that caucus is not working electorally, right? Like that's not working through the outside brand sort of electoral labeling side of things. It's suggesting maybe that caucus, to the extent that it's important and it exists, is working more internally cohesively to sort of shift the agenda on the inside. Another thing, again, this is sort of going to be more relevant when we talk about the results and the empirics, but maybe something to think about setting up in the theoretical side at the beginning is the sort of timing, the time period at which you're conducting these empirical tests relative to the important timing, the sort of relevance of these brands. And you're testing these Blue Dog theories in a time when the sort of Blue Dog caucus has arguably waned substantially relative to its peak influence. Whereas the Tea Party, maybe 2014 is even too late. Late 2014 is a little even too late. By then, maybe the brand has been sufficiently co-opted by the party that you're not getting the sort of full impact that it would have had in distinguishing members if you had done the same test in 2010 or even 2012. Sort of related to that, the Blue Dog caucus is an interesting one because it is sort of historically a regional caucus as well. So I was wondering to what extent you want to think about several of your caucuses have either sort of regional or other types of factors in identifying them. They're not purely ideological. So I don't know whether you want to set up specifically different theoretical, sort of bring those components of these caucuses into your theory section, or just to look at it differentially when you move to the empiric section to sort of think about particularly how it's functioning in the South, where it's that's where the caucuses historically existed.
Andrea, one thing that follows on several of the comments is that it's not clear from a pure electoral standpoint that if caucuses were only created for the purposes of trying to send a signal to voters that become part of the winning coalition, unless you're talking about primaries, why would you ever get a caucus that was to the outside of the party's medians, right? So I mean, one of the things that seems sort of counterintuitive is that you get a fair number of these caucuses seem to be more extreme than their party labels, and yet most of these incumbents are never going to be challenged in primaries, right? So they virtually never have an incentive to send a signal that they are further away than the party if it's all about trying to win the pivotal voter. And so I think, you know, part of it is that you definitely need to tell a story that at least has some element of the primary in it if you're going to talk about that as being the primary motivation for some of these incumbents. Okay.
So this is still theory, but unrelated to what we've been talking about. The co-opting hypothesis is not super developed, and I don't know that I really understood what you were talking about until I actually read the experiment and saw that you were kind of futzing with the way you describe whether you're actually in the caucus or whether you're in a Tea Party group. Right. And I don't know if I would develop that further and talk about it being a separate hypothesis. I think I'd be much more comfortable having you say, hey, you know, the Tea Party is an organization that exists outside of the caucus setting and the formal caucus in the Congress, and so talking about the Tea Party as like a grassroots organization makes sense as well. And I don't know, just having it be almost more of a robustness check than a separate hypothesis. Okay. I think as it stands now, you'd have to do a whole lot more work to convince me that there's a theoretical reason why, you know, for voters that may not be super aware of this stuff, that being in the Tea Party that's a local group versus the Tea Party caucus, that's a pretty fine distinction. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if in the empiric section that people who are reading that aren't actually just picking up on the fact that it says local groups support you, as opposed to it being this theoretical difference between organic Tea Parties and formal caucus Tea Party or whatever. So,
one, if I can,
Chris? Yeah.
So I know I started this all off by saying, I thought that this could be carved out just the external, and the more I hear the dialogue, I mean, it would be quite a shift. But you've got these, whichever one of the early tables where you list all the kind of party faction caucuses in this time period. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was advocating this kind of focus more narrowly in order to go deeper into what you've got, but there are a lot of important differences, and to some extent, to follow up on Ellie's point, where you've got, and others, that there's two types or two motivators here, right? You've got the kind of internally focused caucuses and externally focused caucuses. And maybe actually they can't be separate papers. I mean, maybe that's what everybody's saying is, I don't know, I'd be curious what the rest of the panel also thinks about this, right? But that if you kind of try to embrace that difference as a typology almost of kind of these two different ones instead of trying to find their similarity. I don't know how others feel, or if that just takes this too big as a single paper. Or not.
No, I think that's a good idea. I think, especially if you essentially then broke off the final section, the sort of party valence section, sort of move that into a separate paper, you could essentially focus this paper more on the ideological components of factions and brands and how they work internally and externally, and sort of temporarily just wall off the valence component and leave that for a future paper. Would be a sort of different way to split up the things that we're talking about.
Any other theory comments before we move on? All right, well, let's move on to research design and or empirics. So, Michael, you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, so I a couple, nitpicky but minor things. I already mentioned. I would love to see some more analysis of the differences of what people's perception of the parties are.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see some more analysis where people you account for what different ideologies are. I think that fits with some of the other stuff we've been talking about. What are the goals of caucuses and being a member of caucuses? Who are you trying to target and trying to assess a little more carefully these kind of internal congressional debates versus reaching out to constituents versus reaching out to activists. I was really nitpicky. The graphs I think are a little hard to follow.
Okay.
I don't know that I can tell exactly where Schrader is relative to everyone else, and the big black blobs for Democrat and Republican. I would love for there to be like a dot and some 95% confidence interval or just something so it's a little easier for me to tell where all the 95% confidence bounds and the point estimates are. That's super nitpicky, but I think both of those would be kind of nice to do a little more work with. But in terms of research design in general, the really nice thing about experiments are your research design shockingly clear because you have like a treatment and control group, and it's not very often where someone shows me a difference in means test and I'm like, wow, that is wholly appropriate and thoroughly convincing. You don't really need much else there. And in fact, in some ways, the OLS model that you show later in the paper, I was kind of getting used to your difference in means test. I was wondering if you give me another one of those. If for no other reason than the grassroots caucus stuff, it's hard for me to tell the difference between those two since you didn't give me a difference in means test on those. But
okay.
So that's what I got for now, at least. So.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, no, I'd follow up and say, I agree. I think the clarity is really great. I actually wanted them to be more parallel myself, and some of that may be because now, I know the Tea Party thing's in flux, but I kind of wanted the same difference of means and a little bit more the Tea Party to look like the Blue Dog to kind of get a better sense of how to weigh your two findings or think of them consecutively. And one thing that I think might be helpful in the research design section is to talk a little bit more about kind of the choice of these two, their differences, similarities, generalizability a little bit, and I guess some small nitpicky things. So one thing I thought was really interesting on the Tea Party design was you picked a woman, which on one hand, of course, I'm happy there's a man and a woman in the two examples, but I wonder if the fact that the Tea Party results, at least at this stage, look a little different than the Blue Dog results, right? And so one of the things I was wondering was, is there any gender effect that kind of having an organizational stamp on gender mattered differently? You also noted that she was the co-chair of the Tea Party caucus, not just a member of it, whereas I think Schrader is just a member of the Blue Dog Coalition. So there's some minor things, and I didn't know if they were deliberate. Yeah, so he's described as a loyal member of the caucus, the Blue Dogs, and she's tagged as a co-chair. So I was just curious if you could discuss, maybe even just a footnote, but kind of there are these small differences between the two, and I think I was expecting more parallelness, if that makes sense.
Can I just...
Yeah.
So he's described as a co-chair of communications as well, and he actually is a co-chair of communications for the Blue Dog Coalition. Originally, I had Elise Stefanik, I think that's how you say it, from New York, as the congresswoman, and the goal was to pick someone with positions that weren't I don't know if moderate's right, but not clearly sort of Tea Party positions to sort of dampen the baseline of conservative perception. And she has all these nice things about U.S.-Canadian relations and things like that. During the IRB approval process, that was thoroughly gutted, including her picture. I think this is maybe a post. I think this might be a response to recent events, but yeah. So anyway, there was an explicit sort of thinking. I could put that in. I don't know if that would be helpful to put in a footnote or an appendix, sort of a discussion of why. But I mean, I don't know if there are gender differences. I haven't really thought that through. I've been thinking about these as sort of internal comparisons. And across. Yeah.
So overall, just kind of maybe talk about either present them more parallelly or talk maybe more about why those differences are important in your two experimental designs. That's all I'll say.
Jason?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I agree with what what Michael and Chris have said about presenting your results, but I do think you need to deal with the external validity issue that's apparent. When you're providing this stuff in a vacuum outside of a normal election, outside of us being their member, we have no idea how long these effects would last. But I think you do have some readily available solutions to these problems, though. Do members in these caucuses vote differently? You know, you could plot out their actual voting record compared to other people, and then you could probably use CCES data to see if their actual constituents perceive them differently. If they're in these factions. So I do think you have some data that exists that would help you to deal with a critic like me who would say, yeah, but this isn't real. Right. So, you do have some real world possibilities, and I think, especially if you're going to carve off that back half of the paper, that would be a good way to present that. You could even present the more observational work first and say, how is this process working? Well, I have an experiment that shows this. So, yeah. And that's all I have on that front.
Ellie?
Yeah, so I share the comments that others have offered. I'll offer comments on some different things, just so we don't repeat ourselves. Picking up on Jason's idea of adding a sort of more real-world external validity type of data, I had a different direction to suggest that you go in, which was you to look at the press releases or other measure of how these members are actually campaigning. Are they using these party labels in their campaigns? And sort of like, you could do a really rough measure of just looking at the press release databases that others have created, and not create your own from scratch, but just for those pre-existing databases that exist, just do simple term searches on Blue Dogs and Tea Party and just see what's there. And to the extent that you do see those labels, that would be a sort of encouraging sign. And if you see differences and sort of how they're using them differently, that could shed some light on what's going on. Related to that, you had in your Appendix 3, you mentioned this manipulation check about respondents putting the Blue Dogs to the right of the Democratic Party and to the left of the Republican Party. 52% of them did place that correctly, which to me felt almost as if it was random, right? Like 52% is not that's guesswork basically, and there's no statistical test that you can do that will differentiate that from guesswork. So I think you want to just sort of think a little bit more critically about what that suggests might be going on with your data, and sort of how you might tease out whether you want to use your activists as high information folks who are picking up on this cue, or sort of how you want to do this, or whether you want to look at I'm not sure what else to suggest, but sort of trying to sort of think what else you could do to dig in there. On a different topic, I was on a Midwest panel over the weekend that was specifically devoted to the Tea Party caucus, and so there were a number of papers that were relevant. But one of the big topics of conversation, and you were there too, right? And one of the big topics of conversation, right, was about how the Tea Party caucus had essentially collapsed within Congress by this election cycle. That it's sort of defunct. We don't even have current membership, but sort of all of these things about the sort of internal side of it never really worked properly or did much actually within Congress. It sort of was this outside electoral label dynamic. So again, sort of trying to think about how we can take advantage of this variation, or at least be incentive to what's going on there. Picking up Chris's suggestion about the sort of gender differences in the candidate labels, you might look at, Catherine Pearson has this working paper on the sort of gendered partisanship, looking at how female candidates engage in more hyper-partisan rhetoric, essentially because Republican female candidates are perceived to be more moderate than others. They engage in all this additional hyper-partisan rhetoric to compensate for this. Anyway, you might look at a little of this literature as well. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, I know you may end up moving this to a separate paper, but just I wanted to highlight it. When you're talking about the sort of valence brand section at the end, which I think is interesting, one thing that you aren't looking at that I think is a natural thing to look at or build on, especially if this becomes a standalone paper, would be the sort of thing, one of the things we classically think about in the valence brand literature, the sort of classic McCubbin's example, is actually passing the budget on time and government shutdowns. And this is specifically what the Tea Party is known for, is the sort of things that are supposed traditionally to destroy the party brand, or these government shutdown type things. And so rather than ignore it completely, you might want to have a sort of separate follow-up to sort of talk about sort of, you know, both how the faction is viewed because of that, but also how that sort of factional activity is then affecting the caucus, the party brand as well as the caucus brand.
I have a just insanely minor point. I'm always worried, and you know, since you didn't use a fake Schrader, I'm worried that maybe you accidentally have some people from Oregon who actually know who he is, and the treatment doesn't work. I don't know. I would like you to reassure me that no one from Oregon's in there. Rerun the numbers with no Oregon people or something like that, just to make sure.
Yeah.
Because you know, I'm assuming everyone else in your sample has no idea who that guy is.
I think there are 4 people that are from his two people from his district, and 4 from Oregon or something, and nicely balanced across control and treatment. But I haven't really.
It would be worth like a
footnote or something.
Robustness footnote check.
Okay.
Kind of thing.
Okay. Okay.
So well, this is sort of moving backwards or bridging the empirics and the hypothesis, or the empirics and the theory. But I guess so. In general, I really love tables like Table 2, right, where there's an attempt to very clearly map the hypotheses onto the empirical tests.
Right.
The problem that I have with the way it's set up is, I think, a more fundamental issue, which is that, as I think is often tempting when we do experiments, we construct our hypotheses to anticipate the treatments that we're going to give and the experiments that we're going to run, right, and forget that the hypotheses are actually supposed to be derivations of, you know, conceptual, theoretical assumptions, right? And that ultimately, when we, you know, that the experiment we run is just one operationalization of the hypothesis, and we could operationalize it without an experiment at all, or we could operationalize it, you know, in a number of different ways. And I guess, you know, to me, the hypotheses, even in that table, but even in your description of your first characterization of the hypotheses. So, for example, you know, if we look at you know, on page you know, even look at like the activist hypothesis, there's the, you know, the language is already in basically in terms of the treatments that you're going to give, and in fact, you know, explicitly in the, you know, first these is the party brand hypothesis by randomly assigning caucus affiliation in an informational treatment, right? I mean, so we've moved completely beyond any sense of how the hypothesis follows from first principles and develops as a conceptual point. And I guess, you know, I see 2 problems with that, right? One is that it makes it very hard to evaluate whether or not your experiment and whether your treatments are actually good manifestations of your concepts, because you've never stated the concept in the hypothesis. But as a second point, it forbids anyone else from trying to test your theory in other ways and apply it in other ways, right? I mean, you've effectively narrowed the implications of your theory, as stated here, to only what you're going to test in this paper, right? Whereas if you can sort of give us a theory that has implications stated more generally, certainly in the format that you're ultimately going to test, but still as conceptual hypotheses, then I think a table like Table 2 makes a lot more sense, right? Because it says, here's the conceptual hypothesis. Now here's the way we're going to measure the concepts. And in this case, right, it's that we're going to create, you know, administer a treatment, and we're going to observe a certain outcome. But, you know, you could do this any number of different ways. So I guess I would push you hard to try to, you know, reformulate your hypotheses in a more conceptual way than you have currently. Any other comments on empirics or research design?
I did have a question about whether you removed your activists from the first analysis when you're sort of just looking at normal voters, because I'd like to see that essentially when the activists are removed, the sort of non-activists actually have enough information to differentiate
Okay. Yeah, so if that's driving the general results as well.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, all right, I can take a look at that. I don't do that there. I didn't think that. Yeah,
Okay.
so I'll take a look, yeah.
All right. Any final points? So, or we could kind of open it up to the whole paper. Anybody have anything that they missed, or anything that didn't quite fit in the discussion, or anything that occurs to them now that didn't before? I have one minor nitpick, Andrew. I would change. I think you should never have a section titled literature review, because it sort of commands people to fall asleep.
Right.
And actually, in my experience, what is ultimately the literature review section, Jeff does it as well as anybody, right? I mean, what is a literature review? He sort of characterizes as something else, and he kind of convinces he sneaks you into a literature review that you don't even know you're in the middle of. So
Yeah, right.
I'd go try to take a cue from him and see if you can reformulate the way you frame that, and certainly the way that you title the section.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Any other comments before we wrap up? Andrew, any final responses or thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess I just, so I had initially thought of this as one big paper where I was looking at sort of the internal and external effects of caucus membership, so voting behavior, as well as these sort of cues, and then I had broken these apart because it just seemed really unwieldy to test all of these things in a really rigorous way. And it sounds like, in general, it's unpersuasive to just look at the cues, because when you're thinking about the Blue Dogs or any of these groups, really, the sort of internal legislative bargaining side of things sneaks its way into the reader's mind. So any other general advice on sort of synthesizing this in one paper, I guess, before we wrap up?
Well, I think a little bit of that is things we talked about previously about having some differential expectations for groups that are in the majority, or groups that are moving towards the middle versus groups that are on the edges, right? And I think if you can theorize a little more carefully about that and take advantage of the fact that you have variance in your respondents, that's going to help kind of, I think, link the what are we doing in the chamber and what does it mean versus how are we communicating with our constituents. So I think that's my gut instinct for how I would try to combine those, is link member motives in chamber and who they're trying to appeal to in chamber with the kind of cues you're looking at now, and try to paint a little bit more differentiation between the expectations you see between the two groups and break those out by respondents, subgroup, ideological subgroups, right?
Okay.
To follow up on that, I think is that you'll have different expectations for the activists, or whatever you're going to end up calling them, based on which type of party caucus you're looking at. So the ones that are most explicitly electoral, like maybe the Tea Party, you would expect to find that your average person can understand that cue. But something that's really an inside Congress caucus, more like the Blue Dogs or some of the other ones, the activists might have a larger effect precisely because they understand the internal reasons for that caucus existing, whereas your average person wouldn't. So you might be able to leverage both the difference between the type of receiver and the constituency, and also the differences of the internal, external focused caucuses in that way.
Okay.
We might similarly look to some of the lobbying literature on the sort of which groups do sort of insider strategies versus outsider strategies, and sort of draw on some of those theories about sort of which strategies do some of these different caucus subgroups might pursue, depending on the different resources at their disposal. Not that there are exact parallels between those literatures, but just as a sort of framework, you might way to organize the hypotheses. Okay.
Any final thoughts, guys? Okay, well, let me thanks Andrew for putting your paper up for discussion, and
thank you.
To the panelists for doing participating, and we're going to try to organize some sort of gathering at APSA for all the folks that participated in LSVW the first year. But definitely, please pass the word around. We'll send out, sort of try to advertise a bit and send out the call for submissions for next year. But please encourage your colleagues and students to, keep an eye out for that and put their papers in. We're hoping to, maybe double the number we did. We did 5 this year, 5 or 6.
That's right.
We did 5 this year. I mean, it would be great if we could get up to, 8 or 9 or 10 next year, have them more regularly. And, of course, that'll mean that we'll be calling on probably most of you again, and hopefully some of your friends and colleagues, you can tell that, it wasn't too painful, so that they should be willing to participate. So anyway, thank you guys, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
All right. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.